Welcome to Navigating Wealth, a podcast where we apply a high net worth lens to economics, investing, and lifestyle questions. Today, we're thrilled to welcome Jason Passwaters. Jason is a former Marine Corps and FBI counterintelligence specialist. Today, he's the co-founder and CEO of Intel 471, a leading cyber threat intelligence company that he grew to $20 million in ARR without any outside funding. In today's episode, we cover real-world stories of identifying, tracking, and bringing leading cyber criminals to justice, personal security for high-net-worth individuals, what makes you a target and what you can do about it, how AI is lowering barriers for bad actors and what keeps Jason up at night, and much more. I hope you enjoy. Hi, I'm Tad Fallows.
Hi, I'm Sriram Golapalli.
And I'm Matt Scheckman.
And today we are absolutely thrilled to welcome Jason Passwaters. Jason, thank you so much for coming on the podcast here today. Before we jump into discussion, would you be able to just give us a thumbnail on your personal and career journey over the last several decades?
Yeah, so I started off in the United States Marine Corps. I spent just under 12 years there. First job in, could have pretty much did anything, but I said, hey, I want to be in the infantry. That's why I'm joining the Marines. Ended up, got married young and had my first kid, my son, in 2001, and decided that, I needed to do something as far as, getting some career skills that would work on the outside, not just the soft skills. And couldn't find anything at the time, so I moved over into what's called a lateral move MOS within the Marine Corps, a specialty in counterintelligence and human intelligence, and really specialized in interrogation, low level kind of intel operations, tactical level stuff. From there, left in 2008 and landed at a company, a small company that had a contract with the FBI and essentially doing network forensics. So I was fairly self-taught on, a number of different things within cyber. So I started helping agents around the country track cyber criminals, more focused on the network forensic side, and ended up linking up with a guy named Mark Arena from the Australian Federal Police. We saw the world the same way. They had this kind of incident-centric mindset when it came to cyber threats, where I have an incident, I'm going to respond and figure out what happened and then we'll do the cleanup. And we said, hey, there's this underlying world that we're immersed in. We're tracking cyber criminals. There could be an opportunity to attack that and be more proactive and complement that with your reactive approach. And from there, landed and went into the private space in the threat intelligence space when it just started getting going. The rest is history. 24 started our own company, and we built it out through our first exit with Thoma Bravo on the private equity side. And right now, I'm leading the company through some strategic stuff on the M&A side, but also just scaling out the business.
Well, thank you so much for that background. And later in this conversation, I think we'll kind of revisit each step there and love to double click on the questions. What we typically do to start the podcast is we take one topic that has come up a lot in the Long Angle platform and just, kick it around a little bit with our guest. And so I think for you, naturally, one of the things that comes up a lot amongst the membership is cybersecurity. And I realize what you're doing is not quite the same as personal cybersecurity, but you probably know more than the rest of us about it. So I think a lot of the questions are people feel like, hey, I am a potential high profile target. Let's say I've got 10 or $20 million and my name has been attached to some private equity exit, like you're saying, for example. So somebody out there who really wanted to could figure out I'm high value target. I could probably spend all day, every day hardening my cybersecurity presence, but then I can't live my life. Where's the right way to draw that line, and what's the right balance? Is it things like cyber insurance? Should I be deleting every social media profile? Should I be trying to hide my personal address? I'd love to hear, maybe starting out with yourself as someone who knows more than the rest of us do. How do you think about that?
So I think that it's about footprint and managing your footprint. That's how I approach it, right? I think it's unrealistic to think that you're not going to have social networking accounts. You're not going to have, accounts through so many different online services. And then it's just about managing that footprint and simple stuff. Maybe I think just hygiene related, using a password manager to make sure you're using very unique, really complex passwords, but not the same password, because that's oftentimes, an easy win for a bad guy is to basically pivot off of a compromised credential and then go into another account. And even to this day, I talk to people and you can always just ask them, you say, hey, are you using the same password for all of your accounts? And they're like, yes. They kind of look down, and then you can just guess. I bet it's some kind of, some kind of combination of one of your kids' names and their birthday. And they're like, yes. And, stuff like that, I think, is just basic hygiene. And that's how I think about it is, just making sure I have good hygiene on, the accounts that I'm maintaining, my password and how I manage my passwords. I personally don't have cyber insurance. It's not something that I'm super familiar with in myself, but I mean, I think if you're a very high profile individual that has liability, it's always something, to look into.
And Jason, where do you see that line maybe of high profile or actually being a target versus just these are generally applicable rules to anyone? I mean, I know a lot of the people in our community are like, well, I've amassed, $5 or $10 million, for instance. Does that make you a target? Or is it just like, look, you're one of a million people of which everyone is targets. And until you get to the, $1 billion club, nobody's like specifically trying to go after you.
Well, I think everybody's an opportunity, right? But you typically don't become, a lot of it's opportunistic, and in financially motivated cybercrime in particular. It's very opportunistic, and the bad guys are doing things at a scale that they can't really dig into individuals all the time. But I would say somebody that has, 10 million bucks in their account, or has, large portfolios that they're having managed or managing, once that becomes knowledge to the bad guys, then you're now right on their radar, and then you're going to be a target. But I think the initial thing is, just don't come into their view by having bad hygiene, by having, by not practicing just the basics in how you can protect yourself with some of the stuff I said before.
And so just coming into their view, by its nature, let's say you're a CEO of a public company, you can't hide that fact. Is that what you mean by coming into view, or is there something else that puts you on the radar of a bad actor?
No, I think that's one of them, and that's a bit of a different scenario than, say, somebody with a lower profile but just has amassed wealth and has a lot of money that could be stolen, kind of deal, or is just could become a high profile person if they were hit by a cyber criminal. In the case where you have a public company CEO or somebody in the executive team, they have a high profile just inherently, and they offer a pretty juicy target to bad guys specifically, especially now with extortion being a big deal. When I think about it, in terms of those cases, managing your profile is really all about the social networking stuff. It extends to family as well. You're kind of an extension of your network's public, public presence as well in a lot of cases. If you look at the case when the CEO of the United Healthcare, that was a crazy situation that I think exploded the digital footprint space, managing that digital footprint, because of the massive risk it can have for a company to have somebody out there and somebody able to kind of connect dots and say, hey, where does this person live? It can be anything from something that egregious to just doing protest outside the CEO's house, or something that would be more, um, brand or image related.
And one idea I've thought about and curious for your take on whether this is a reasonable way to go about things is, I think for a lot of people, there's a couple places where most of their assets sit. Maybe it's in some brokerage account with Fidelity or something like that. Is it reasonable to try and think about locking those down? So even if you can't easily move the money yourself, so even if somebody compromised it, it just sort of you created friction in the money movement process. Is that a reasonable way to think about making this more effective?
Yeah, and again, it goes back to, there's a lot of stuff that's opportunistic when it comes to financially motivated cybercrime. So if you can make yourself a hard target, they'll move to a softer target. So yeah, there's absolutely the validity to that.
Maybe this is a good segue to, before we get into your journey, I think one other thing that'd be really helpful to the audience here is if you can give a kind of thumbnail overview or a framework for how you think about the cybersecurity and or cyber threat landscape, because I think to a lot of the novices out there, it's very hard to keep separate what is
Sure.
Cloudflare, CrowdStrike, Intel 471, Palo Alto Networks,
Yeah.
antivirus. It's sort of all this blur. How would you think about explaining that to a layperson?
Yeah, I see it in two ways, internal and external. So if I think about just the business world, when it comes to cybersecurity, you have to have vendors that help you understand your internal situation and then protect yourself from, bad guys getting in. And that would be the internal side. And, that's the companies, like CrowdStrike, Palo Alto, they're doing endpoint stuff. They have a whole suite of different things for this internal kind of visibility and coverage. The other side of it is more the external side. So I think about it in terms of like what's required now for CISOs is not just that internal side, but understanding the external situation, the threat situation, and understanding, hey, like, when the bad guys look at me, what opportunities do they see that exist? Now, that's kind of proactive because they might not be exploiting it now, but if I understand what opportunities they do see, then I can, start cleaning that up. And some of that can be very specific to just hygiene stuff like, look, all the bad guys are hoovering up all these compromised credentials. They're using malware. They're then pivoting off of different accounts. Maybe, one person is using the same password and they can pivot off of an account and get in. And it might not just be the CEO. It could be the person that is maintaining the IT systems. That's a high value target right there. So understanding kind of when the bad guys look at me, what opportunities exist. Now, that would be more of a tactical kind of first start when I think about intel, that exposure piece. As you mature on kind of understanding this external space, then you get into what I consider the core threat intel space. And this is where you have teams that are specifically tracking threat actors and threat actor groups. They're monitoring this underlying world that exists to support cybercrime. And I view that as very much like any kind of market. It's products, services, and goods. Threat actors are in there buying, selling, collaborating, and communicating, all with the main purpose of making money. You also have state level actors that are engaging in there as well. A lot of the stuff you read on the news, even in a state level, sometimes there's a nexus to a cybercrime, a cyber criminal. SolarWinds is a good example that, if you remember that one of the most impactful nation state cybercrime events ever. And it originated in the underground marketplace from a Eastern European cyber criminal who sold it to nation state threat actors. But if you want to conceptualize it, product, services, and goods, it's a marketplace. It's got consumers. They're doing marketing. They're doing all that stuff you can imagine. And then the last thing is what I do about that stuff.
And just to be clear, you're saying that the bad guys here are this marketplace that you have.
Yes, these are
service
illicit marketplaces. 100% illicit marketplaces that all support cybercrime, and they're doing all the things that you would think about in a normal business, from IT support, to their customers, which are other bad guys. They're doing things like marketing, they're doing brand management when complaints come in from customers. So there's this whole underlying world that supports that and has all these things that we're all very familiar with our own businesses.
And can you talk about that a little more? I mean, I think you hear things like North Korea or Russia or China based and, but it's not really. So is this actually like Vladimir Putin is running a cybersecurity operation, or is it, a bit more nuanced than that? Is that just a shiny object or?
No, it's much more nuanced than that. I mean, I highly doubt that that's happening. When you think about the nation state side, it'll just be part of a broader strategy that says, hey, if I'm in this underground marketplace and every day there's threat actors, very well-known threat actors with brands that they've built over years that are selling access, their specialty, they all specialize in something. So they're specialized in what's called an initial access broker. And an initial access broker is somebody that will compromise an organization and then sell that to somebody else. They'll sell it to anybody who's got the money to buy it. Now, if I'm a state level actor, why would I not be monitoring this space, for, a very juicy target that could be for sale? And then I can pay probably pennies on the dollar on what it would cost to do a full scale. I also have plausible deniability in terms of if it goes public and it was kind of it was just cybercrime. There's all these, it's just a source of information and specific intelligence that could, help a state level operator achieve their objectives.
So, not to go down this rabbit hole too far, although I feel like we should. So then on the state level actor side, are they playing on both sides of the spectrum? So on what they're playing defense, they need to be part of this ecosystem to understand what's going on and who the players are. But then when the right opportunity strikes, they're like, oh, we'll buy that too. Like, how does that world operate?
I think that it's probably compartmentalized much more than, having the same ones knowing, the defender and the offensive. The way I see state actors in what I call the underground marketplace, they're co-opting other cyber criminals to do their bidding. Okay, so we've seen that before. We've seen it where they're, active participants in buying things within the marketplace, like I just explained, earlier. Now, there's moonlighting going on as well. So they're a state level actor that will be doing their day job, doing stuff, in that space, and then they'll use the underground marketplace, they'll moonlight to make some money. And then there's also the corruption piece where straight up people in a specific country, they're shaking down cyber criminals or leveraging them in more of a face-to-face kind of perspective.
And would you say, Jason, that like in the terms of the actual intent behind this, is it sort of everything from like crippling the electric grid to like ransomware of like, an A-list celebrity or government official and, things like that? Or is it everything in between? Or is it sort of,
I
what
think,
kind of things do you see?
the marketplace supports all of that to varying extents. I would say the mass majority of everything you're going to see is financially motivated. Bad guys are in there just to make some money. And that's what it's all about. And they make a lot of money. And then you're going to have more of the opportunistic stuff where, you might bump into state level actors that are, they have very specific objectives and they're just out there looking. It's a source of potentially achieving your objective. It's one of many they probably have.
Jason, when you say marketplace with respect to all of these goods and services, I mean, from my naive perspective, all I know about this or can imagine is like the quote unquote dark web. What does this marketplace look like? Is this, the black web side of Amazon and there's just like a list of services? Like, how do people access this?
So I don't particularly like the term deep and dark web. It's kind of taken hold and it's done a good job in kind of getting people aware of this world. But to me, it's not dark, it's not deep, it's very finite and very organized. It's forums and chat rooms, it's threat actors and groups that have built their brands, that maintain those. Look, I've tracked actors when I was at the FBI supporting cyber agents. I mean, some of them are still operating to this day under the same brand. They all have these different specialties that they offer to the marketplace. Anything from malware as a service to, coding services to infrastructure providers. So, folks that are providing the actual back end and front end infrastructure to conduct cybercrime, you name it, stolen credit card information. So everybody has their different specialties and they just kind of work together in this very capitalistic vibey world. I mean, and it's like if you take away the morality aspect of it, a lot of people in business would be fairly impressed with the scalability that some of these folks have achieved. And then of course, with AI and stuff, at the forefront, and they're leveraging it just as much as anybody else. It's only going to get worse.
Literally today, this morning, I got an email from one of the banks I work with, and it said, I'm going to read it here. It says, dark web activity detected. Sriram, we've detected some unusual activity on the dark web regarding your personal information. To protect your privacy, we aren't including any confidential details here. And obviously, I was like freaked out. This is the first time I've ever gotten like that kind of message from anything. So I spent like a good 15 minutes trying to like click on these things, get to this thing. It's a whole story, which I'll share more about later. But at the end of the day, my email address had been exposed. Like that was the extent of this dark web leak. And I was like, guys, like this is like false alarms are so, it can be alarming. And I'm generally like a reasonably smart guy. I could sort through it. But like, if you don't have any idea what's going on, you could lose your hair. You could like call the police, like, anything could happen. So, I know on the consumer side, I'm curious. It's hard to navigate this honestly. And how do you kind of think about this? But what are the ways to kind of evaluate these things? And, I think Matt, you made a comment, I think not on this call, a different one, where our information must just be there anyway. Like, I feel like my credit card has been stolen or taken, or my social security number is like Home Depot's thing. Like these things every day, my information's out there. Like what's really actually private anymore? Like what do people actually need to be caring about these days?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to kind of managing your footprint to some extent. I mean, I agree. I also am of the opinion that like all my stuff I just operate as if all my stuff is out there to some extent. With credit card stuff, I've used the virtual credit cards with very specific limits, that can't be reused, for certain things. And I've done little things like that to kind of mitigate the impact if something were to happen. But of course, I use all the basic stuff. Like, everything I've got is two-factor, authentication. Like, if you're not using two-factor and a password manager for all of your personal stuff, then it could get pretty painful pretty quick. And it's just a real hassle when somebody is able to take over an account or do something. And then they pivot into your work because everybody's so connected personally and socially and then also professionally. So they're able to just pivot around and it can get pretty nasty pretty quick.
One last question on this illegal marketplace. How there's the phrase, there's no honor among thieves. How do you manage, quote, running a real business where you can't resort to, contracts or rule of law or any of that to, help, or even probably, a proper accountants to help support your business?
Yeah.
And maybe related, if you know that this same guy for the past 15 years has been doing something illegal, you have friends at the FBI, you were in the Marines, like how has that guy not been taken? Do you actually know who it is and we just can't nail Igor? Or,
Look, there is a infrastructure provider that I personally have been tracking. As CEO, I don't get my hands in the fun stuff as much, but I used to scratch the itch by focusing on what are called bulletproof hosters. And I've probably been tracking this guy for, I don't know, 10 years. And I knew we figured out his name. I mean, he's not like he's very well hidden. And he only just now got arrested and we had identified him ages ago. I mean, I was talking at a big Black Hat conference about this guy in 2016. I think it's just they're able to locally operate somewhat with impunity. So there's no real relationship between law enforcement agencies in some of these countries like the US and Russia and whatnot, to the extent where they're actually going to arrest somebody or extradite them. There's also legal things such as, like, say, Ukraine. But the Constitution basically makes it impossible to extradite anybody. So what happens is you got to, track them over time, wait for them to go to Spain for vacation, or, they pop into Poland or something like that, where we have better reach, and then they can snatch them up. So what was the other part of your question, Ted?
Oh, it's just sort of how you run a business if you can't rely on the rule of law to, how do I make sure somebody pays me
Yeah.
at the most basic level?
You talking about within the marketplace amongst bad guys?
Yeah, if I'm in the marketplace of
reputation
illegal
is
behavior.
everything. Yes, reputation is very, very important. So yes, there's always scams going on, but what I would say is at the upper end, we're talking the very organized cyber criminals that are doing the most impactful and most lucrative things for them. Reputation is huge, and you can quickly mess your reputation up and your brand, and that will impact your business. It's it's one way is that you can think about how do you counter this threat. You could get in there and mess up everybody's reputation, and that might be one way to kind of shake things up a bit. The other thing is there's like escrow services as well. So there's actual specialties where it's a full-on escrow service where I'm going to do a transaction with another threat actor. I'm going to put, a couple $100,000 in escrow until the whole thing is complete. And then there's an arbitrage, like a whole process to get it out. Or if there's complaints, they review the not contractual, but the agreement between them to see if they actually met the agreement or not. And then the escrow will offer a verdict, if you will.
That is crazy. And actually, one other question, how big is crypto in enabling this space? I could imagine it's a big unlock in making this more efficient. Is that true, or is it still all dollars?
No, it's true. It is true. It's a big part of it. I mean, back in the day, I remember, in the earlier days, 2008, 2000, maybe 13, like in between there, a lot of it was all like money being stolen from accounts, then sent to mules that were they were on like J1 visas and stuff in the US. And they would then Western Union, MoneyGram or whatever, the money back over to you. And then the money would then get taken out of banks over there or dispersed out there. But virtual currency has changed all of that.
That reminds me, when Stram and I ran our software company together in the early 2000s, we had a number of software developers in Uzbekistan. So we would have to regularly take out, tens of thousands of cash in Western Union to Uzbekistan. And I think almost every employee in our country ended up on the Western Union blacklist for sending too much money to Central Asia.
It used to be that way where the money would be just kind of, and in the model, you could like track how much money. So you see a cybercriminal. I remember we tracked some guys in Donetsk, Ukraine, and they had stolen $120 million over the course of 18 months or so from medium and small businesses around the US and the UK and elsewhere. And you see these numbers, but the reality is this model works, all these folks work together and they have their specialties. So the money is stolen from the account. Then the money is, taken out by mules, and then the mules will send it over to Eastern Europe. And then there's a guy in Russia, like there's one guy, he was basically had front companies where the money would be transferred. They would put the money on in bags and then put it on a train from Russia into Eastern Ukraine, and then the crew there would then pick it up and have cash. One of them were running a full scale web money, which is kind of the earlier, I would say, virtual currency type stuff, or at least like a PayPal-ish type of thing in Eastern Europe at the time. And that supported it as well. So
How much of the threats that you work on day to day, Jason, are like a more physical in nature? I'm reading this fascinating book about basically the internet cable infrastructure. There's like nearly 1 million miles of internet cabling across the oceans.
yeah,
It's a fascinating read. And it's amazing today what you can do if you, like some of these countries, especially like in Southeast Asia, are highly vulnerable. And if you cut this all out, they're not being set out like years or decades. It's like hundreds of years could be set back because of how much they're reliant on this sort of stuff.
yeah.
Is that just totally different from the kinds of things that you work with or see day to day, or is it sort of highly related?
No, I think it's a lot different. We support corporations and businesses typically, like maybe 15% of our revenue is government actually, and that surprises a lot of people. So we support enterprises that are looking to protect their organization from cyber threats. And that's a much bigger strategic problem. That would be probably federal level or, national asset level tracking and coverage.
Wow, I think we could spend all of our time just hitting you with these questions. I want to go back and dive a little bit into your career arc. So maybe, starting when you really started working in this industry when you were in the Marines. Is that right?
A little bit. I mean, this industry wasn't around when I was in the Marines. I was at the very beginning of it.
Okay. And so was it more, um, and actually, maybe how much do you feel like the industry has basically grown up, alongside you? Was it this sophisticated when you started, or was it a bunch of individual actors in their basement kind of deal at that phase?
Yeah, so the way cybercrime has evolved is very much like I was explaining that marketplace. I wouldn't say it was threat actors back in like 2008 and whatnot. It wasn't really threat actors that were in the basement. I mean, that was probably before that time. But what you started to see is folks that were starting to work together across countries, between different countries. They most of the time, maybe different now with the Russian Ukraine situation, but a lot of times they didn't really care about the issues between countries or nationalities. They work very well together. And so back then, what you saw is these kind of networks and groups started to kind of get built where, I talk about the money mule situation, and that's still an issue. They were basically, formalizing and professionalizing that and scaling it out and sending people to the US specifically to do this. And, so you just started to see all this, like these business models get really mature over time. And it's just kind of evolved to where it is an ecosystem, if you will, today that is pretty impressive. Like I said, morality aside and the ethical aspect of it.
And so as you and, your co-founder, Mark Arena, started both on the public side and then went to the private sector, what did you see as the big differences working on this as a public employee versus private?
Well, so when I was in the Marines, I was in the counterintelligence human side, but I was also what's called a technical surveillance countermeasures specialist. So for just to simplify, it's like looking for bugs, right? So I used to scan, walls and stuff. And I used to sit there and think to myself, this is just weird that I'm in this building. There's computers in the entire facility, theoretically connected to other computers around the world in different countries. And I'm looking for an AM, FM, or a digital transceiver, like in this concrete that was, this building is from the 50s or 60s. And I really wanted to look at the computer side of it, at the network side of it. So I started digging in that. And that's why I left the Marines actually, is because we weren't focused on the cyber aspect of the threat as much as I wanted to. And that's what really I wanted to do. So when I got to the FBI, there was that whole mentality. It's kind of investigative and reactive mentality. And then I've seen that whole mentality change, or at least the new mentality of saying, hey, we have to have the reactive side covered, but we also have to be proactive. And you've seen this whole orientation towards the external threat, tracking it day to day. The difference between the public, I think the private sector is much faster in building capabilities. There's just an older mindset oftentimes in the public side that takes just ages to change. So I've seen that as a big thing too.
Can you speak a little bit more about the government side and maybe some of that preventative things, but probably more specifically what the ecosystem looks like? So we've talked about the bad guy side and how developed that is and the private ecosystem. But then there's also, you were at the Marines, 6 branches of our military defense space. Then you have the FBI, NSA, CIA, et cetera. How do they all work together? How does this all fit into the ecosystem? How close and intertwined are they with like the work that you're doing right now, or CrowdStrike and Cloudflare and the various other private organizations?
I don't really have the insights to kind of answer that to any real depth. But maybe just something to point out that what you've seen probably in 2016 during the election, actually the run up to the election, and there was a botnet that was being used. It was called TrickBot, actually. And we've developed a system internally to track malware at scale. It's like an emulation framework. So we were able to watch somebody was trying to take over this botnet. And we saw them do test runs in September. We saw them then ratchet it up and go hard in October, right? When everything started getting going. And it turned out that was Cybercrime. So, I don't want to, I can't really answer your question on how everybody's working together. I just don't have those insights. But what I will say is there's definitely been a mindset shift that says, hey, financially motivated cybercrime, and this is finally, I always say finally, this is here. Financially motivated cybercrime is a national security threat, and that has now been accepted. And you're seeing disruption operations occur. It's not all public, I'm sure, but there's a lot enough public stuff out there to say, hey, there's definitely been a shift where state level assets and operations are targeting, financially motivated cyber criminals. And the election, and then the other one I think was the Colonial Pipelines one. That was another big one that folks said, okay, this is real. This is a real national security threat. We need to do something about it.
And that, Colonial Pipeline, if I understand that correctly, that was basically ransomware, I think is the category that falls into. Is that right?
Ultimately, it was ransomware, but it would have started. I don't know. I'm not gonna. I'm going to assume it started with something much more, maybe hygiene related. Eventually, at the beginning, I do know that it used other specific types of malware to do the exfil, that threat actor that we've tracked for a very long time. And malware called System BC. That's a malware as a service, so it's all these other components working together. Ultimately, ransomware was the final, the below, I guess, as well.
And I guess I'm wondering, it seems like ransomware has been a very durable, or I don't know, sustainable, has a lot of staying power as a business model. Is that true? Or in your experience, is that, the main asset class, or are there several different, models that come and go in popularity?
I think it's just the evolution. And yes, that right now is the primary moneymaker, if you will. But again, there's so much more behind that supports that business model. That's just one of the final stages, if you will. But there's a lot more to it, that go up to that point.
Jason, maybe we can switch a little bit and talk a little about your private equity arc and journey. How did you pick? Why sell? Do you mind sharing a little bit more of that story?
Sure. So Mark and I are practitioners at heart. I mean, we weren't business folk guys when we started the company. We just thought we could do something. We saw a change in our space, and we were, we've been here since the beginning. So we said, let's do this. We can do it better than anybody else. And that all worked out for us. We got to a point in 21 where it was kind of a decision to says, hey, do we want to continue this? And it's going to be like a lifestyle business. But we had never wanted to create a lifestyle business. We had always seen an exit at some point. And we said, hey, we're to go to the next level. We want to do some acquisitions, and we want to kind of scale the company out to a much bigger thing. And we said, we need to get a partner. We're either going to find a strategic, or we're going to find a private equity firm. We had bootstrapped the company up to this point. So
How many years was that?
2014, so to 2021 was that 7 years? Yeah, so we bootstrapped it out to 20 some odd million in ARR, and then we said, hey, we need to get a partner in here. And it was interesting because as somebody who did, we didn't come from Silicon Valley, we didn't follow the typical playbook where, you get some seed money, you could do an A round, a B round, and, at some point exit. We bootstrapped it out. We had every single receipt that we'd spent anything on. The lawyer who's my GC now that we had at the time, I remember him saying, you guys don't even have credit card debt. Like, what is going on? We don't ever see this. And we're just like, we don't know. We just did what we did. This is all, we thought this is how you do it. That actually translated really well into the PE world, that mindset or that kind of way of working. And I can only imagine, having the VC stuff, doing the VC route, and then, having to deal with how do you be lean and mean and, kind of focus more on profitability, in a much bigger way. So 2021, we did a process. We had, I want to say 7 or so options with a couple strategics in there. Strategics were 25% lower on the valuation, so we didn't want to go that route. We love the idea of a second bite at the apple, or at least, a new phase in the company, reset the clock a bit. And we ended up with two different options, where on one, we had a firm that we thought was going to be somewhat hands-off. And then we had Thoma Bravo on the other side. And Thoma Bravo has a very good reputation. They pick winners. So we were excited about that. But they would also allow us to realize our full potential, both individually, but also most importantly as a company. And so that's why we went with Thoma Bravo in the end.
And to back up on that bootstrapping, I mean, getting to 20 million ARR with zero outside capital in 7 years, that's incredibly impressive. I realize we can't, get every step of the way here, but you've now looked at a lot of other companies as well. What do you think that you did that was different that allowed you to be that capital efficient?
It was about staying very focused on what we were good at. There's always this pull to kind of do something else and do something more and do something different. But I think we were always very disciplined. And also we couldn't afford, the way we were operating, we were investing everything back into the company to make it better and what we were doing easier and whatnot and more efficient. But we really couldn't afford to take risks because, we had bills to pay and stuff, and, you're bootstrapping a company and you want to build it out. But I think a lot of it was just being self-aware and realizing what we're good at. And we're going to stick to that. And we're going to own that. And we're going to own a very specific aspect of the market. And even to this day, that's how we grow. We have a very disciplined approach to growth, and our go-to-market is very laser focused and disciplined. And I see companies in phases. Now is not the phase that we're going to be, a $250 million company overnight. That will be the next phase of the company as we continue the journey. This phase is getting it to, 60, 70 million. And how do we do that? It's not about saying, hey, we're going to go conquer, well, maybe that's not a good word to use, but we're not going to go into Asia Pac. We're not going to go crazy in the Middle East. Right now it's all Western Europe, the United States. That's where we're going to build a business.
And was it basically the same business that you knew you were starting day one and you just execute that playbook, or did you have a lot of pivoting and discovery along the way?
No pivoting at all. We stayed focused on what we knew, what we were good at, and even within that, it was a very specific niche within that. My background being human, we specialize and own that human intelligence mission, which is basically engaging with cyber criminals and producing intelligence, and then all the automated stuff that goes to support that. If you ask anybody in the market, we're known for being the best of the best at that, easily.
Can you speak a little bit more to that? Who's your target client and what are your main services?
So we have we as a strategy, we're owning the top end of our market, right? That is the threat intelligence piece, the pure play threat intelligence. It's threat actors that you want to track, that you want to monitor, that you want to be alerted to. It's all of the intelligence we produce. And then if you're thinking about more of a Fortune 2000, Fortune 1000, those type of profiles, they're typically going to be the folks that have an intel team. Not always. There's $30 billion companies that still haven't built an intel capability. But that's the typical profile. I focus mainly on Western Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. We do a lot of business there. And we do a lot of business in, like, say, the Middle East and stuff, just as a go-to-market strategy. It's not something active we do. But those are typical profiles where they have the maturity that says, hey, we've got a good handle of our internal situation. Now we need to get a good handle on the external situation. Who's going to give us that visibility and coverage? And then the tools and the data to kind of operationalize that to mitigate risk, improve security and whatnot. And that's where we come to play.
And then, sorry if I'm being a little obtuse or if it's obvious to others, but so then is this, you're just selling data and information, kind of like, here's the Rolodex of state actors that may be, malicious towards your company? Or is it more of a, this particular company has these concerns in this specific area of the Middle East, and then you go out and you're like, all right, well, then I'm going to find this threat assessment for you and then provide a report? What does that end product look like?
Okay, so to simplify it, we provide coverage and access to this world. And what that means is we've got teams around the world that are monitoring the threat, literally monitoring threat, engaging with threat actors. And then we have automated collection or automated intel collection capabilities that are also collecting all of that stuff, chat rooms, forums, that kind of stuff. And we produce our own intelligence and reporting, and that's complemented by that automated collection as well. And so then let's say an organization says, hey, third-party vendor supplier risk mitigation is a top concern of ours. Because if my key third party gets hit with ransomware, it has business impact. You can use our platform to monitor for all your third parties, be alerted as soon as there's exposure through a third party being compromised. And then you can pivot and say, okay, well, I need more context. Who are the threat actors? What have they done in the past? What are they capable of? So that's the intel piece. That's the exposure piece, the intel piece. The hunt piece would be our threat hunting platform, where you can take all of this, distill it down into what's called a hunt package, and then deploy that across your enterprise to say, hey, am I susceptible to this? Worst case scenario, maybe I've been compromised already and I don't know it.
Our last few minutes here, I'd love to get a little bit to your personal journey. One thing I can only imagine is hearing you talk about being very in the weeds and maybe not having a personal relationship with these bad actors, but pretty close to a personal relationship. Does that impact your kind of mental health or view on trusting people if you're just day in, day out dealing with these people who are dealing in dishonesty?
No, I don't think it has. I'm super desensitized to it all. What, like, some people will come in and it kind of blows them away. And I'm just like, oh, that's just like day-to-day stuff that we see every day. It's nothing. I think that's one thing that I've been super desensitized to it, but I don't think it impacts my mental health. I love the cat and mouse game. That's a big part of what's driven me. Back when I was more a practitioner, chasing down the bad guys was just, I lived for it. That's all I love to do, is just connect dots within data, chase down bad guys, attribute the bad guys, and then figure out how they do what they do. And then ultimately, hopefully they get caught and thrown in jail, but that doesn't always happen in this world.
Do you have any fun stories that you're able to share about an example or two of one where you were really able to do that successfully?
So we've got the crew in Donetsk that I talked about. This is one that really got my intel background and my cyber background as a network forensics person combined. So there was a case that was ongoing. I was involved with it, where probably about 100 or 150 of the top cyber criminals in Russia and Eastern Europe decided to use a very specific server for chat. And I specialized in the protocol behind that chat application. And I would then be given data every 90 days, a whole cache of data from that server. And then I would have to programmatically process all of this stuff. So what ended up happening is going from more forensic analysis to now I'm seeing the actors talk about, hey, I just had a baby. I'm terrified if I get, extradited to the US. They're doing 30, 40-year sentences for folks like me. Or the political stuff. Like, there was one threat actor that, he was the really good friends literally with the presidents of an Eastern European country, the president's son, who was his godfather to his daughter. You start to see all the human aspect to it. And so we tracked those guys down over the course of a couple years. I think we pretty much attributed the entire team in Donetsk, Ukraine. We knew early on who they were, who did what. But again, these guys just operate with impunity sometimes. So when the war happened, he actually moved to Ukraine and Kiev, Ukraine. And he had an apartment 2 blocks from our main office in Ukraine. We had a large presence in Ukraine. So that was an interesting one.
And is Ukraine still with impunity? It's just interesting, getting that much Western support if they're kind of
I think
able,
it's
still a safe haven.
Well, the answer to a lot of this is through diplomatic kind of relationships between countries and law enforcement, agreements between law enforcement. Ukraine is definitely better, but it's super corrupt, still. The running joke back in the day was, if you went to the anti-corruption unit and went out in their parking lot, they're all driving Benzes and Beamers, in a very, I had a case where I would do reports when I was at the FBI. And again, I was a contractor. I wasn't like an agent or anything, but I did direct support and I was heavily involved. I wrote reports based on my analysis off the data, and they went to the FBI agent, and we were working with the SBU, which is the police within Ukraine that handled cybercrime, these kind of cases. And I remember getting a refresh of data, and I'm analyzing what the actors are talking about. And the one actor is telling the main guy, I've never seen this one actor come in, and he's telling the main guy that we've been tracking, who have stolen tens of millions of dollars at this point, maybe $100 million by this point. And he says, hey, the FBI are onto you. I've read the report. And I had the realization that this guy is actually talking about the report that I wrote, 90 days ago or 60 days ago, because he has somebody that he's paying on the inside that, has insights or has access to this stuff through their relationship with the Bureau. And now I'm reading come full circle, back to me. So that stuff still goes on. I'm sure that they like to shake down cyber criminals as well. So.
Well, I want to be respectful of your time here. Maybe a last question from me is, and thank you so much for being generous with your time. What keeps you up at night as of today?
I think, I'm so immersed in this stuff and I'm so desensitized to it. What keeps me up at night is probably, with AI making things easier, faster, lowering your barrier of entry, seeing a Colonial Pipelines or a SolarWinds type incident, but seeing many of them at the same time because AI has helped folks scale out, their operations. I think that's probably what I would lose sleep over.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Any last things you want to share before we wrap up here?
No, my pleasure. I really I love jumping on and just kind of talking about this stuff. So super thankful.
And if anybody wants to follow you or is interested in learning more about Intel 471, what's the best way for them to get more information?
You can hit me up on LinkedIn. I'm, pretty accessible through LinkedIn. You can go to our website, just do a Google search, you'll find it.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your time today.
Yeah,
Thank
no
you,
problem.
Jason.
My pleasure.